Hello, welcome to the lecture on organized interests in Texas politics. This is the first of the two audio recordings on this lecture. What's an organized interest? This is an organization established by a number of people or organizations who would benefit from a particular policy being adopted. These people or organizations hire organized interests, also known as influence groups or lobbying firms, to simply influence or pressure policymakers for adopting that particular policy. Some other names that we hear about these organizations are lobbyists, special interests, or pressure groups. Why do people join interest groups? They join for informational benefits, first and foremost. So, for example, I am a member of the American Economic Association, and as a member, I have access to data that I use in my own research. So, to become a member, I pay dues every year, which is, along with donations, is the main source of income for these organizations. Second reason is material benefits. So AARP comes to mind when we think of these benefits. That's American Association of Retired Persons. They open motels on the roadside, on the highway side, and they provide discounts on insurance, etc. So a lot of people join this organization to take advantage of those material benefits. Many of them may not even be aware of what this organization works for, yet this organization collects their money and they lobby the U.S. government for various purposes, whatever they may be. Solidarity benefits are a third type of reason why people join these groups, and this is simply the sense of belonging that they get by joining a group with like-minded individuals. As I mentioned, members' dues and donations are the main source of income for these groups, interest groups, and they turn around and use those dollars for influencing policymakers so that they adopt policies favorable to their members' own interests. What are the common types of interest groups? One of the most common type is the so-called corporate groups. These are interest groups or organized interests established by particular companies. In many cases, just one company creating a lobbying firm, and the purpose is to promote or to serve the narrow interests of that particular company in policymaking circles. So, for example, AT&T has an interest group, and it's one of the largest spenders on lobbying, this company is, in the state of Texas. A second type is trade associations, and these are interest groups established to promote common interests of all businesses in a particular sector. Texas Association of Realtors would be an example. So they exist to influence policymakers to adopt policies that help the realtors, all the realtors in the state of Texas somehow. And then you have single issue groups, which are organizations established to create, reform, or abandon certain laws on a particular topic. Texans for Gun Safety would be an example of this type of organized interest. And then there are public interest groups, and these organizations exist to serve the common interests of the society at large. Texans for Public Justice would be an example. However, we need to be careful about this public interest label. It can be used to mislead people at times. For example, Partnership to Protect Consumer Credit is an interest group that exists in Washington, D.C. And when you hear the name, it sounds like a public interest group, but actually when you dig deeper, you see that they're nothing but a credit card company's lobbying firm that pressures policymakers for deregulating the credit card industry against credit fraud, which is a service to the narrow interests of these companies, but not necessarily to the public. And then you have the labor unions as another major form of interest group, and they exist to promote the interest of workers for better work conditions and compensation. Then lastly, you have intergovernmental organizations, and these are lobbying groups where one government organ somewhere hires to promote its own interest in another government organ. For example, the state of Texas has a lobbying firm, and this firm tries to influence policy makers in Washington, D.C. so that the federal funds that flow into the state of Texas every year would be maximized. When we look at Texas politics, we see that the biggest lobbying spenders have been certain associations and corporate type of interest groups. AT&T's interest group has consistently been the top spender last several years. And then you have other companies like American Electric Power or Encore Electric Delivery or CenterPoint Energy. And then you have associations like Texas Medical Association, Texas Trial Lawyers Association, Oil and Gas Association, and Association of Realtors as other big spenders on lobbying in the state of Texas. Here, as you can see on the 16th place, City of Austin is also a big spender on lobbying, and their lobbying organization would be an example of an intergovernmental lobbying firm or interest group we discussed in the last slide. Money spent on lobbying is actually a very good type of investment for many businesses that lobby for the purpose of getting tax savings from the government. Average tax savings for each dollar spent on lobbying was $220. So these organizations spent $1 and they get $220 of savings in taxes for themselves. So numerically speaking, this is 22,000% return on investment for these companies, which explains why we have so many corporate type of interest groups, which was the first type of interest groups that we discussed a few minutes ago. So let's discuss the pros and cons of interest groups. Interest groups or organized interests have been a controversial aspect of the political system in the United States since the earliest days of the Republic. They are allowed to exist in our political system because they are treated as institutions that further democratic credentials of this country. They are considered as institutions that allow citizens to exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech, political participation, and petitioning the government. So 3 different rights that are mentioned in the First Amendment come to life in practice thanks to interest groups. Theory of pluralism is what's commonly argued to support interest groups, and this theory argues that the presence of interest groups in a political system is a beneficial thing for the democratic credentials of a country, as long as there are many interest groups competing with each other to influence the government. James Madison was an originator of this idea. In Federalist Papers, he wrote that factions, which is what he called interest groups at the time, more the number of factions, better it is, because it would mean less concentration of power in terms of who dominates policy making. In practice today, we see that interest groups function in a quite different way. Yes, they do exist. There are many, tens of thousands of them in Washington, D.C., but they're not all created equal. Larger the amount of money they can control, more influence they have on policy making, which creates unfair competition for most Americans because wealthy citizens can collect more money for their interest group and also organize more easily than the rest of the society, and accordingly their interest groups have larger resources to dominate the legislature. Secondly, the interest groups or lobbying firms are considered as legalized forms of bribery because they offer monetary benefits and promises to elected officials which corrupt them. In this next slide, there is a short video that makes this last point about how interest groups, lobbying and campaign contributions make corruption a legal practice in the United States. It's a very thought-provoking video with very good illustrations. So because of time limitations, I won't be able to show it here, but I will be adding a link to that YouTube video. Please check it out on your own term as a part of your study on organized interests in the state of Texas. This wraps up the first of the two audio representations on the Organized Interest in Texas lecture. Please make sure to check out the second video below.